Need new glasses or want a fresh new style? Warby Parker has you covered. Glasses start at just $95, including anti-reflective, scratch-resistant prescription lenses that block 100% of UV rays. Every frame's designed in-house with a huge selection of styles for every face shape. And with Warby Parker's free home try-on program, you can order 5 pairs to try at home for free. Shipping is free both ways, too. Go to warbyparker.com/covered to try 5 pairs of frames at home for free. warbyparker.com/covered.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds, and I'm here with Keith, co-star of my upcoming film, If, only in theaters May 17th. Do you want to tell people the big news? All right, I'll do it. Sign up now and you'll get unlimited for $15 a month and 6 months of Paramount Plus Essential Plan on us. MintMobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 equivalent to $15 per month. Unlimited over 40 gigabytes per month. Face lower speeds. Videos at 480p. Active Mint customers by 531.24 get 6 months of Paramount Plus Essential Plan. Auto renews after 6 months. Offer ends May 31st, 2024. Separate Paramount Plus registration required. Terms and conditions apply if rated PG.
Everyone knows therapy is great for solving problems. But getting therapy has its own problems too. Like finding the right therapist, fitting into their schedule, and of course, the cost. Well, BetterHelp can solve those problems. It's totally online and built around your schedule. It's surprisingly affordable too. Connect with a credentialed therapist by phone, video, or online chat, all from the comfort of your home. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more and save 10% on your first month. That's BetterHelp, H-E-L-P.
I did say that to you 14 years ago. And what you said at the time, you went, no, we just need to do our thing and then it will be right.
We got it right. And now they're going to come along and mess it up.
Welcome to the Power Test. I'm Ayesha Hazarika.
And I'm Sam Freedman.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Power Test. Education, education, education was the famous slogan that helped sweep Tony Blair to that landslide victory in 1997. So we're going to dig into some education policy because, Sam, I believe that's a bit of a pet topic for you.
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about for a little while. Now, my background is very much in education. I started working in the sector 20 years ago now and was in the Department for Education 2010 to 2013, working for every Labour listener's favourite Tory, Michael Gove, and Dominic Cummings, who everyone loves too. So
great guys.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Actually, I get on quite well with Michael Gove, too.
Michael I like. Dominic I have some bigger issues with, but maybe we'll get onto that.
This is an episode that quite a few of our listeners actually tweeted us saying it would be really good if you could do something on education. And education is very much centre stage. It was one of the pledges, the 6 pledges that Keir Starmer announced, recruiting 6,500 teachers paid for through ending tax breaks for private schools. Before we come on to that, what did you think about the pledge card? Did it give you sort of 1997 vibes?
I think the pledge card has turned into a bit of an obsession in British politics. People think it was incredibly important in 1997. In fact, it actually didn't make any difference in 1997. By the time they launched the pledge card, they were already leading in the polls. In fact, they dropped back in the polls after they launched the pledge card. Yes, it was quite a useful campaign device to have 5 pledges that every candidate could talk about, but it wasn't anywhere near as important to that victory as it's subsequently become mythologized as. But now every single Labour leader has to have their own pledge card, whether that's on a mug or a stone, Ayesha.
I think you'll find that I was very busy on a pink bus, so I am not having that. But see, I slightly push back on that because I've seen you tweeting about that, but I think psychology matters in politics as well. And I think what this pledge card has done is for all the candidates who have said, so many candidates have said to me, where things get a little bit kind of difficult on the doorstep is once you've gone through, my goodness, the Tories are bad, and the person on the doorstep goes, yes, the Tories are bad, and they tell you why the Tories are bad. They then go, but we have no idea what a Labour government would do. We know that Labour's leading in the polls. So I think it's not insignificant as the sort of political device that a pledge card sort of gives.
I agree that it's useful to have like 5 or 6 things for candidates to say. I don't think it needs to be on a card. I don't think it needs to be...
Oh, it has to be on a card because otherwise people will never remember. Unless you had it on a T-shirt, but you can't be wearing your T-shirt the whole time.
All I'd say is the Tories have won quite a few elections over the years and they've managed to do so without a pledge card. But what matters in any election is having a clear message, right? So if it helps you move towards a clear message, however that is formed, then that's useful. But if you look at the actual pledges, there's only 2 on there that are really quantitative, you'd say, one of which is the teacher pledge, which we can come on to. And and the other one is bringing the NHS waiting list down by, frankly, a pretty unambitious number. And it's fair enough to set not hugely ambitious targets because you want to be able to say that you've met them within the first year and so on. But I do think from a policy point of view, putting aside the presentational aspect, it's more of an offer than the Tories have got, for sure, but it's not a wildly exciting offer, I wouldn't say, as yet. And if you look at the teacher pledge, yes, 6,500 teachers more a year would be very handy because we do have a massive teacher shortage, but they didn't actually say how they're going to get them. Those places are already paid for. We know if we could recruit more teachers, we have the money to do so. The issue is people don't want to be teachers, and that's a much bigger problem, which raises much wider questions about the education sector. So fair enough and probably quite useful, but I think it leaves quite a lot of questions open.
I think what's interesting about it, I was speaking to some Labour strategists and, they were saying, look, this is just a kind of stepping stone on the way to the manifesto. And this is not the kind of final thing. And they're very clear to make sure that candidates and everybody else say, look, this is not the kind of final landing point. But I think what the Labour Party's been struggling with is that these 5 missions have just sounded quite woolly and visionary and a bit esoteric. And at least now there are some kind of tangibles that give people somewhere to go to. And it's part of that longer term strategy that we talk about. They're kind of caught between, they have got this massive poll lead. They are trying to be really cautious because Labour just basically never wins elections, unlike the Conservative Party. But they are aware that whether you're a candidate on the doorstep, whether you're a shadow cabinet person on the sort of Sunday morning breakfast round, the thing you get really squeezed on is, but you haven't really got anything tangible to say. So at least they have somewhere to go. But look, let's dig into education now. And Sam, I'll let you introduce our guest because it's somebody that you know and respect a great deal.
Yes, we have Laura McInerney, who was a teacher, journalist, editor of Schools Week newspaper, and then set up Teacher Tapp, which is a way of surveying teachers every day and understanding how teachers are thinking about different sort of policy issues and what's going on in the classroom, and is incredibly valuable for policymakers and journalists wanting to understand education. Hello, Laura.
Hello.
I'm very glad you're here, Laura, because otherwise, at one point, it was just mooted that it would be Sam and me just doing this together, and it would just basically be Sam doing a monologue on education.
Yeah, whereas now I've got a foil, because when I was in the department, Laura was writing articles about how bloody useless we were. So it feels good to sort of be able to reflect on that period and also what Labour might do next with someone who was fairly critical of what we were up to back in the day.
So Laura, let's as a starting point. You're a real expert in education along with Sam. As an opening gambit, what do you think of what Labour is currently offering on education? What do you think is good? Where do you think the gaps are or the weaknesses?
So I think the 6,500 teachers in the pledge card it's a good pledge in that it's got a number, it sounds pretty big, and it will work on the doorstep. I think if you're in education and you're aware of the fact that there's more than 24,000 schools, it feels a bit like, one limb of a teacher for every school. It's not very much. So I don't think it's winning the education crowd over, but politically, I understand why they've gone there. In terms of some other stuff that they're saying, the things that are very popular with teachers is they've talked a lot about mental health. So they've promised things like mental health hubs in every area, more mental health professionals in schools. Now, Sam said earlier, the problem with that is, well, how are you going to do that? It's very easy to say you're going to have more mental health professionals, but it takes a long time to train them, and it's not always something people want to go into. So that one is going to be about the detail. Other things they've talked about, free breakfast clubs. This has been in manifestos for the last 10 years. I think the Conservatives tried it in 2017, famously put aside 7 pence for each breakfast, and it didn't go down particularly well. But, breakfast is a good idea. And then the controversial one is curriculum review. That's the one that on the ground in schools, I think there is division over and is a bit of disquiet.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. They've been pretty vague about what this curriculum review is. I always think there's kind of 2 types of review. The one where you know what you want to do and you do it quickly, but you get someone respected and well known to front it up to give you a bit of credibility. And then the one where you don't know what you want to do and you want to long grass it for 2-3 years. This feels a bit more like the latter to me. Do you think that's fair?
Maybe, but I don't think it matters either way for people on the ground. I remember back in 2010, Sam, sitting with you and kind of begging you not to do loads of curriculum change for the same reasons that I think the teachers now won't want a load of curriculum change, and they won't really feel differently about it in 2 or 3 years' time than they do now. It's loads of extra work, When someone comes along and changes the curriculum, it means you have to rewrite every lesson plan, every resource. You have to rethink all of your assessments. It's just hours and hours of work. And for politicians, it doesn't feel expensive because the teachers are already being paid for anyway. So for them, this is exactly, it's practically free. You get to go on telly and talk about exciting things like English and poetry and which part of history is the most important. And everybody loves the phone in and you can get the headlines. Sam's nodding because he did all of this, right? The problem is the people who are on the ground have to spend ages and ages and ages then reworking everything. And you're already busy with everything else, with behaviour, with attendance, with the fact that child poverty has gone up. So they won't want it, not because they necessarily are in love with the curriculum. And there are a whole bunch of teachers who want some changes. For example, less content in science, a little bit of change in the primary curriculum. What they won't want is wholesale change, which is what unfortunately tends to come about because it's good for the politicians.
And I guess you've got this sort of fear from some parts of the education sector as well, that they could introduce quite a lot of muddled thinking into the curriculum. And we look at what's happened in Scotland with the introduction of curriculum for excellence about the same time as we introduced our last curriculum. What's going on in Wales at the moment, where they're doing a big curriculum reform exercise there, is that they're moving in a sort of direction of 21st century skills, if you like, and lots of vague terminology about things that we like kids to be able to do, but moving away from a sort of more traditional structured curriculum. And the evidence, certainly in terms of attainment in Scotland at least, is that has not had a very positive effect. They've gone below England in this big OECD PISA study and so on. Do you think Labour are sort of conscious of those risks? Do you think that there is a danger that we might end up going down the same kind of route that Scotland or Wales? Maybe you don't think it's a danger.
I think Labour are conscious of it because it's the one thing that the Conservatives have got to throw at them at the moment is anything that's not happened particularly well in Wales is being thrown at Labour repeatedly, whether that's transport or health or in this case education. So they're very aware that those PISA scores do matter and they won't necessarily want to risk them. But as you've just said, there are some other issues that were a bit muddled in the thinking of the last 14 years. For example, by focusing purely on academic learning in a very traditional way, what we've ended up with is a packed, probably overpacked curriculum that can be quite demotivating for those students who fall further behind at certain points. And it's all very well to say, well, you've just got to catch them up and we'll put loads of extra initiatives in. But actually, there isn't a broad range of qualifications available. I think there is a challenge around the primary curriculum. Specifically, primary teachers tell us on Teacher Tapp that focusing on very detailed grammar, having to still teach things like Roman numerals, these are not good.
That one was just Nick Gibb. To be clear, the Roman numerals was just Nick Gibb wanting Roman numerals.
Sam. I'm
not fussed about Roman numerals.
Listen, if you try to pin the headstone on me, you can own Roman numerals.
Fair enough.
But so there was a bunch of muddled thinking in terms of assessments as well. We've ended up with tests happening in our schools at very funny times. So students now take tests at 11, they take them again at 16. We've got these multiplication checks and phonics checks. They've kind of worked okay, but there's certainly scope to go back and say, has it been good? And if Labour can manage to walk the tightrope between solving the problems of the past and not running too far in the direction of something very different, then we'll be in a good place. But again, I did say that to you 14 years ago. And what you said at the time, I still remember, was you went, no, we just need to do our thing and then it will be right and we can stop. And that's what every politician thinks.
We got it right and now they're going to come along and mess it up.
I love Sam getting schooled, Laura. You've absolutely made my day, I have to say. So look, many of my listeners, our listeners are going to be quite expert in education. Many of them are not. When it comes to the curriculum and what we're teaching at schools, and this is probably like stepping out a bit with a non-expert sort of hat on, a lot of people feel, and certainly when I speak to businesses, they do feel that kids are sort of coming out of school maybe not equipped with the right skills to sort of get them on in life, whether it's verbal communication. You have a lot of people saying that if there was a bit more creativity in the curriculum or being taught them, the kids could be more sort of confident. What's the right balance that if Labour does win the next election, what's the right balance of modernising what kids get taught at school so they do have skills that can help them in the workplace or if they go on to higher education or further education, between what Sam would argue is, look, you still need to teach people facts. And to your point, you don't want to like rip up everything again and do like a massive set of reforms. Where's the kind of sort of sweet spot for that?
I think there is a perennial issue with employers saying that people don't have the right skills. You can go really far back in history. I mean, you can go back to like people learning to be knights and this being an issue as to whether or not they should be learning jousting versus sort of
coding.
Poetry. Exactly. We have to be a bit cautious as well about believing that just the curriculum on its own is what solves things, right? We teach children maths almost every day, many hours over their lifetime. And yet by 16, there are still lots and lots of young people who are not that great at maths. So just by writing on a piece of paper that we're going to teach some skills that employers may want, like oracy, which is the big one that Labour is leaning into, doesn't mean that it's going to get solved for those employers. Possibly where there is a rebalancing is that over the last 14 years, a number of things that have been hard for schools to deliver on reliably in qualifications have dropped away. For example, speaking in English exams. It's quite difficult to fit that in terms of time. It's quite difficult to reliably mark it and ensure that the grading for it was going into the exams in a really clear, fair way. So what happened was it was removed. There may be an argument for bringing it back in some capacity. Now, science is an example of this, where doing experiments is quite important, but how do you actually mark that? So instead of having to do an experiment in your science exam, schools are expected to do a set of science experiments that is sort of part of your course, but it's not necessarily graded. Labour may want to look at, are there certain skills that you build back in? And even if we don't give them a grading, say for an exam, do you do something else? Wales have been quite interesting on their 16 to 19 baccalaureate, which is where you do have to do certain activities, extended projects, doing service in your community, where you can still get a check mark, a passbook, lots of different ways of doing this. But if you're my age, I'm sort of early 40s, you might have done something that was called the National Certificate Record of Achievement. You've got these glorious leather booklets that were supposed to explain what you'd done in school for various projects. And actually, they weren't really valued. They were very expensive and they've become a kind of white elephant. So again, Labour's going to have to go down the line of trying to figure out what they should bring back in. But there's always a tendency to go too far, try and formalise it, spend a lot of money on it, and it's still not valued because it's not in the qualification.
I wanted to move on to something else that Labour have talked about and is probably within the education world, particularly for school leaders, the thing that they're most interested about when I talk to groups of head teachers, which is Ofsted. There's been quite a lot of controversy about Ofsted over the last couple of years. Well, there's always a lot of controversy about it. And Labour have said that they want to move away from single word judgments, which basically mean at the moment in an Ofsted report, a school is called outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate. They're saying we won't give that sort of single badge to a school. Instead, there'll be more of a report card, more of a narrative. I'm quite worried about this reform, not because I think Ofsted is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but because I think it unlocks a whole load of really complicated and tricky issues which Labour haven't really thought about yet, particularly when it comes to the consequences of changing Ofsted for the way they actually manage and intervene in schools. Am I over-worrying about this, or is this a bit of a Pandora's box?
Well, there is legislation currently on the books which says if a school gets a certain grade, then you have the powers to intervene. If you change those grades, you're going to have to change the law. But that's what you're in government for, to change the law. So I understand why they don't necessarily want to shy away. And in terms of strength of feeling on this, we have surveyed teachers about Ofsted grades since we started in 2017. And one of the questions was about whether or not you ought to shift to a pass-fail approach, which was something that leaders often talked about in the past. They would prefer that you only fail if you do something very bad, you tell them what it is, and they fix it. When we asked the question this year, we, for the first time ever, were inundated with people writing to us saying they just rejected the premise of the question. They actually rejected grading altogether, and they wanted completely different options. And we're seeing that more and more as we talk about Ofsted. So if there's anything I'm concerned about, Sam, it's not so much that people are going to be okay with multiple grades. It's that I think they may actually kick off against a whole concept of grading altogether. And then that leaves you in a really difficult position. And in some ways, Labour, and I can't believe I'm starting to get to this position, Labour might be better just starting again, sort of removing everything and starting from first principles.
But that's a massive thing to try and do, because our whole school system is built around these Ofsted judgments in terms of, the Department for Education's ability to intervene in a school that is considered to be not good enough. If you take that away, there's nothing, and you have to start from scratch. This is sort of maybe be careful what you wish for schools. They get this sort of narrative report, which doesn't have this sort of one word that they feel is unfairly summing up their whole school. But then the DfE read that report and are trying to make independent judgments against that about whether they intervene in schools or not. And do I trust the DfE to do that well? No, I don't. And I worry you're going to get a lot of unfairness and subjectivity built into the process, which schools then might discover they don't actually like very much at all when it comes down to it.
I guess the question is, if you got rid of Ofsted, what's all the bad things that you think would happen? And then how many of them can you mitigate? And actually, is it worse if somebody else is making what might be considered to be unreliable, unvalid decisions? Like, it's just really hard to send a couple of people to a school for a few days and give them a grade that's really reliable. And so I sort of come to the conclusion where whatever you do, there's going to be compromises and trade-offs.
And Laura, in terms of the pledge that was announced by Keir Starmer, 6,500 teachers paid for by this getting rid of the sort of VAT exemption on private education. What do you think about sort of both aspects of that? Is 6,500 the right number in terms of teachers? Will that sort of solve the teaching crisis? And also, where are these teachers going to come from if the pay and conditions don't improve? And then what do you think about the sort of the realities of ending this VAT exemption on private schools?
On the VAT and private schools, I think they're just going to have to crack on with it. Again, there'll be all kinds of little consequences around it, unintended or intended, and they'll just have to live with them. I think it's doable. I think they'll get on with it. I think it will be reasonably okay in the long run.
There will be some unintended consequences, and there will be some sort of, short-term issues. What do you think they might be?
I suspect some of it will come around even now from what we're seeing of people doing the early funding. So private schools saying they want money to come in. I think if we end up with some private schools who don't manage that very well, you could see some of them going under. And I don't think it will necessarily be because loads of people will leave. I think it will be because there will be not great management of the cash in what will be a big fluctuating period of time for their fees.
And what about the argument that if people can't afford the rise in fees, then of course they will send their children to state schools? That of course is a completely fine thing to do. State schools are very good, but that will put a lot of pressure on state schools. What do you think about that argument?
Well, that comes to these 6,500 teachers, because a lot of what happens in a school at any given time is down to how many children are born in certain years and then how much of the workforce is available to cover it. So right now, we have a lot of children aged about 12 or 13, right? So lots of people were having children in 2010. That year group is very, very big. And it means that secondary schools at the moment have had to expand quite a lot to take in a big bulge of children born at the same time. We don't have that same problem at the moment. Very few people are having children relatively to 2010. And so what we've got is quite small cohorts starting in primary schools. So primaries are actually having a situation where they may not have enough children. They may end up with an oversupply of schools, and therefore schools will have to close. Now, we're not at the place where we can say we've got an oversupply of teachers, but it is possible that that happens within the primary sector if you end up with lots of low numbers for a long time. Meanwhile, up at the other end in secondary school, everybody's expanded. So now they have to hire lots more teachers. That's happened at a point when, post-COVID, we've lost a group from the workplace through the changes of COVID. We've got quite a small number of people who are in their early 20s, just in terms of population. And we've got all kinds of stuff going on in the workforce. People struggling with childcare costs, so they're dropping out. People who are leaving early for early retirement because actually they've paid off their house and they can get their early money at 55. So there's all kinds of things which mean we've got fewer people in the workforce than we need and quite a big group of kids. But it is temporary. So 6,500 teachers a year for the next 5 years might get you over this bulge as you get through the next 5 years. And then we wait and see. What it's not going to do, I don't think, though, is be enough for the next 2 or 3 years as secondary schools really struggle, because all of this will take time. And so we're going to continue to have quite a hot squeeze for a couple of years, and Labour will feel, I think that very, very keenly. A couple of things you can do, though. Sam, you said before about how much money there is, and you don't need more money for those teachers. But we can plough it into bursaries. And it does make a difference. If you make training to be a teacher much cheaper, you are going to get more people doing it.
I mean, our bursaries are already quite high, and there's a bit of a risk with sort of in the subjects where we need teachers the most, like physics, maths, you're already paying 20, 30 grand bursary. If you put that up to 40, 50 grand, you will start to get people just turning up for the cash and then not becoming teachers. I think it becomes actually quite attractive to just take the money and run. I would personally, if they're going to do any policy, I would just fund PGCEs, the training course for teachers that they have to do. The moment you have to take out a tuition loan to do your extra training year, I would just say, we'll pay that. I definitely think there's ways you could spend some money to boost recruitment. I just don't think the problem is the lack of places itself. It's doing something else to boost recruitment. And really, underlying this, and I think the big challenge for Labour, especially as they have to have very different relationships with the unions to the Conservative Party, is pay. Like teacher pay has dropped by 10, 15%, depending on which metric you use, over the last 15 years. Compared to other graduate professions, it's being paid much less than it was back then. That does just have a detrimental effect on the people who are willing to come into the profession over time.
As with lots of other things in society at the moment, there's a very big divide between people who maybe have lower housing costs, lower commuting costs, don't have children, and therefore the income they need in any given month to have disposable income is quite different than those who have high housing costs. They drive to work and fuel costs have gone up, and they have children. And so the preferences for things like pay versus more flexibility in your job versus lower workload is different depending on your circumstances. Now, amongst younger people, of course, they typically have higher housing costs because they're either doing private rental, which has gone up a lot, or they are trying to get mortgages. And so for them, pay becomes incredibly important. More than half of new entrants into the teaching profession in any given year are those new graduates, people who are just coming out of university. So if you want to be attracted to that group, you are going to have to give them pay that's going to enable them to live. You sometimes find when you survey, you get these different preferences, but if we don't put the salaries up, you're going to struggle to get enough people in over the long term, particularly as those who are more comfortable, who are typically older, start to exit the workforce. And that's going to be a problem.
It's interesting when you look at the polls and what people are really kind of caring about as we go into this general election campaign. You know, cost of living is really, really high. The NHS is really, really high. Immigration's high. Housing is around 14%. But education and schools are at 12%, which is quite sort of low down the list. Why do you think that is? Is that because Sam did such a great job on education?
Yes, that's the reason. Well done for spotting it. No need to answer.
Case closed. Why is it not such a big issue for people?
I think for lots of people, what they want is their school to be a place where their child is safe, they're happy, and they're learning some things. And by and large, even with really reduced budget, schools have worked very hard to ensure that those things have still continued to happen. In fact, over the last 14 years, schools have put a lot more emphasis on safety and safeguarding. Children, generally, their happiness is often related to things like their friends, whether or not they have a good relationship with their teacher. And again, people have worked really hard in schools to keep that going. And then in terms of the learning and the qualifications, as Sam said, a whole bunch of decisions were taken that have enabled the curriculum and the qualifications to at least be seen to be very reliable, very valid. They have a good currency in the world. So as long as your child is going to do their GCSEs and do okay, which is the majority of children, then I think you're feeling reasonably positive about your local schools still. You won't necessarily have noticed that teaching assistants have fallen away, particularly for the more vulnerable. You won't necessarily have noticed lots of things that have been cut because the schools have protected them. I think we are at the end of that. I also think it's a very different story if your child is not happy at school, if your child has not particularly engaged with the learning, or if your child has special educational needs. And I think that whole part of the school system is falling apart pretty dramatically. But there are a small group of people, you're looking at maybe 20 to 25% of parents who have children of a particular age who are affected, and therefore that isn't going to hit your mass polling.
There's a really interesting point here that the only time education's ever been the top issue for people, you look at the sort of Ipsos polls go back 40, 50 years on what's the most important issue. It was 1997. That was the one year where it came top. That's partly because the economy was doing quite well then, immigration was much lower, so some of these other issues weren't seen as being so important. But it was also because Tony Blair was talking about it a lot. He made it one of his big issues. Yeah, education, as you sort of said at the beginning of the episode. Starmer hasn't really. I mean, there is this pledge on the pledge card. It's not that they haven't talked about it at all, but it doesn't feel like it's his big motivating driver in the same way as it was for Blair. Do you think I'm being fair, Ayesha?
I've been thinking about this. I thought it was really interesting that the education was put in the 6 pledges. Also, to have 6 pledges, normally it's 5 pledges. So is it?
You're being a little bit like OCD upset about it.
Yeah, I know. It's like a 5-point plan. Why is it 6? I can't sleep at night. Why are they doing this to me? I did think it was really interesting that he put education in there because it isn't sort of super high, although there are flashpoints like with the rat concrete scandal and, obviously COVID and things like that. But I think he is a bit of an education sleeper cell because I think he has done some of his most personal speeches around education, like particularly talking about themes about social mobility and this stuff he's talked about very passionately about, being from a background where he felt that, things weren't available to him from his background and he doesn't want other kids to have that. And the other speech that I thought was a really interesting speech that he made, very personal speech, was about his desire to get more culture and creativity into school. And he talked about his own sort of background, playing the flute and all this stuff. And then he said, I want to make sure that children get the chance to experience arts and culture at school. And he spoke very personally about that. I mean, they didn't really say how that was going to happen. And they were very careful to say, look, we're not making a funding pledge here. So I would argue that actually, and this oracy thing he's talked about quite a lot, it's something that he for himself feels very passionately about, which is directly linked to education. So I would say that he sort of consistently revealed quite a lot about himself and his background and his character through talking about education. Laura, what do you think?
I think he has. I also think that Bridget Phillipson, Shadow Education Secretary, is excellent. She's really, really developing as a speaker when you watch her on panel shows. I think she's starting to understand her brief. She gave an absolutely storming speech at the ASCL, one of the head teachers union conferences recently, which kind of ended with the point that she herself sees herself as a kid who was on free school meals in a Northern Comprehensive School who's gone on and done very well. And one of the extraordinary things recently, I was on a radio show and somebody made a casual comment about the VAT private school rule. And they said, all these shadow cabinet members in Labour who went and benefited from private school, and actually now they're being very hypocritical. And I took that on and assumed that was true. When I went away and looked, I think at that moment in time, there were only 4 shadow cabinet members who went to private school. What's interesting is for lots of them, they have these great stories, but also maybe they don't feel that schools are in that bad a position. They sort of look at state schools and they think, you know what, we've all done quite well out of state schools. State schools are great. We don't need to champion them and kind of go on about them like in 1997. We can just very casually talk about the fact that we are a product of these people and that there are bits and pieces of things we can do. And I do find it, I think on Bridget, she has got the ability over the election campaign to really pull out some big mistakes from the Conservatives in the last year or so. I think RAC and the concrete scandal has really hit the Conservatives. And it's a simple one to be able to say, their schools are falling down, we will build schools up. I think on mental health and the fact that referrals are just wild and no one can get them for young people is something they could focus on. And the lack of extracurricular opportunities, extended schools, the fact that all of that has sort of fallen away as cuts have come in, lack of music, lack of art. Those are things they can go down the route on, and I expect she will. I think she is bracing for that fight.
What about special educational needs? Because that does feel that is such a huge issue. And how do you think an incoming Labour government should deal with that? Because, I mean, this is a story you're hearing more and more about all across the country.
If they actually want to solve it, the best thing that Keir Starmer could do is already have identified somebody very smart who he is going to put into a ministerial role with that brief and keep them there for a very long time so that they can thoroughly understand and make some decisions. One of the biggest problems is that role has been passed between endless numbers of ministers. Sam, I don't know if you know the number. It's probably well up in the team.
I think it's about 23 in the last 20 years or so. It's a ridiculous number of people who've been children's minister over both governments. But it's in the last 3 or 4 years, it's been sort of 7 or 8 or something ridiculous.
I mean, I don't know how much you think that's contributed to it. I know you've written about lots of the other issues as well, and how hard it was to grasp when you were in power.
Yeah, I think that's right. It needs someone who's there for more than 5 minutes to grip it, because it's never the number one thing on the Secretaries of State's list of priorities. So you do need a minister who's really focusing on it, and we haven't had that. I also think we've got a couple of problems. First, you've just got a basic financial problem. There's nowhere near enough money in the system. There's a sort of wider problem, which is if you've got resources as a parent, this is a system which is miserable to pursue. It's horrible to have to go through, but you've got options. You can go to appeal, you can have tribunals, and councils will know that you have those resources and are going to fight them and perhaps be more willing to provide eventually some support for your child. Whereas if you don't have any resources, you can't necessarily have that fight. And I'm a bit worried that you're getting a real divide here between people who are able to stand up for their kids and people who just don't have the knowledge or money to be able to do that. So there's a real equity issue as well as an overall funding issue now in the system.
Another thing that I just wanted to ask you about is the sort of technical policy stuff that we talked about, curriculum and other things. But one feature that I've really noticed, this is sort of from my journalist hat on, is that schools are in the headlines a lot at the moment linked to the culture war stuff, whether it's sex and relationship, education, whether it's the, transgender, whether it's toilets, whether it's freedom of speech. How do you think Labour should navigate that? Because, I mean, look, some of the stuff is nonsense that's whipped up from certain Conservatives and certain sections of the right-wing press. But there are some issues that some parents do genuinely have concerns about. How do you think Labour should navigate that, Laura?
Yeah, these are real issues for schools, and it's annoying when the government has a tendency in the last couple of years in particular, I think, to cause the headlines, to put out very confusing and conflicting guidance. Even just in the last week, the new sex and relationship guidance, on the one hand, essentially bans teachers from talking about gender ideology, but then requires them to talk about gender reassignment, but must only talk about the fact. Yet there is no guidance on what those facts are and what the difference actually is between the two. And of course, we could say, well, people will work it out. But the fact that the government don't want to write it down or work it out, and yet they're expecting now 24,000 school leaders to do that and be very vulnerable to media flare-ups or anything else, I think is really unfair. So if Labour want to be serious about this, I think we go back to actually the way of dealing with this, which Conservative governments did in the past. When Nicky Morgan was in power, Justine Greening, we had education secretaries who actually really dealt with this very well, put in new guidance, dealt with things very well, worked consultatively with the sector. They didn't inflame people. And I think you just have to go back to recognising their real problems, work with people on guidance, make the guidance really clear, and, change things as you go.
I mean, the sex education guidance, it's not a field in which I am an expert, but it felt very muddled and confusing to me. I thought, it was going to be a real headache for school leaders. I also showed the story about it on the BBC to my twins, who are 14, who are in year 9, and they were sort of looking through it. Do they know we have the internet? They were just utterly baffled at the sort of suggestion that they wouldn't already know about all of these things by the age that they've reached. So it felt sort of a bit otherworldly and a bit confused, and actually really an attempt to kind of keep lots of different groups within the Conservative Party happy, really, rather than give something that would be useful to schools.
And Sam, look, when it comes to things like sex and relationship education, I did a feature on my show at the weekend and had 2 brilliant sort of educators and teachers on. One of the things that sort of came up was, like, this stuff is quite hard to teach for a number of reasons, right? I couldn't imagine anything more kind of difficult and cringy than sort of going in and having to sort of explain, as you say, to a bunch of young people who've probably already seen hardcore porn on their phones. It's really difficult. And one of the suggestions that came in from my listeners, and we kind of kicked this about, was, are there kind of better people to come in and do this teaching, Sam? Are there people who are kind of real experts on this that the kids would sort of listen to more than a kind of embarrassed sort of teacher?
So there are organisations that train teachers to do it well. Like if you're thrown into a classroom without much training or guidance on how to do this, yes, it's incredibly cringy. I used to work for Teach First. Laura did Teach First. One of the sort of moments of horror for a lot of the new teachers was being asked to teach lessons on this and finding it incredibly embarrassing and difficult. But there are organisations that will come in and teach you how to do it more effectively.
Well, so I was a citizenship trained teacher, so this was in my wheelhouse. And then in my second year as a teacher, at that time, the government, Labour, were sponsoring teachers to do a second year of training that I did alongside my teaching, where you could become a specialist sex and relationship education and PSHE teacher. So I hold 2 teaching qualifications, one in citizenship and one in PSHE, personal social health education with a specialism in sex ed. And that's something that I taught throughout my years in teaching. I loved it. I do think that is the sort of approach you should take. You should, if you are a government and you're really deeply concerned about how SRE is being taught. And by the way, we know from Teacher Tapp that around 60% of teachers at some point are teaching these topics, right? So that's either because they're a primary school teacher and they're all teaching them, or because in secondary schools, lots of schools do sex ed by giving it out in form time, getting every teacher to teach one lesson on it in a year. And you've now got all these people who are not trained, many of whom are deeply uncomfortable trying to interpret guidance on lessons that doesn't work well. And I would guess that a lot of the time when there is a flare-up in the media because something has been said in a lesson that wasn't appropriate, it's because it's an untrained teacher trying to deal with something on the fly. So if you want to solve all of those problems, instead of putting more unclear guidance out, put more funding into training specialist teachers, training people to train the others. And I would be wary about always bringing outside people in, because you don't then have the accountability or the oversight for what they're actually saying. And then the third thing is around community cohesion. Labour in the 2000s were very big on this idea. How do you actually ensure that if you have disparate points of view, different stakeholders, different parents with different points of view, that they are all represented? So we actually went out, got all the different religious groups, worked with them on our sex ed curriculum. There was money available to do this. And then we were able to deliver that really confidently for our young people.
I mean, if Labour just want to create 500,000 teachers like Laura, then we're sorted. I mean, that's the easy solution to education. We have to wrap up. I mean, I could go on about this forever, obviously, because it's my favourite topic. But before we do, we've been sort of, with all of our guests this series, selecting a fantasy shadow cabinet for Keir Starmer to lead. You are a specialist on education secretaries, former education secretaries, having produced Education Secretary Top Trump, which I would highly recommend as an entertaining game for the whole family, which is as much of a nerd as I am. Who's the best education secretary that we're having to put in our fantasy shadow cabinet?
The one I would choose is a guy called George Tomlinson, who was the education secretary between 1948 and 1951. And if you imagine that we're a bit snookered now in terms of situations, he was facing something very similar. So, of course, lots of schools had been flattened by bombing. There was this huge baby boom from 1946 on the way. 1 million children were on the way to school. There was a massive teacher shortage because, of course, lots of graduates had gone to war, people had all moved around, different skills, universities had been interrupted, and there was no money. The deficit of the country was also huge. And yet, in and amongst all of this, he did a range of different things. The most extraordinary was he raised the school leaving age from 14 to 15. This was despite the fact there was no money, no buildings, no teachers, and too many kids. He did it because he hadn't got to go to school. And he always said this was the thing that he'd spent his whole life wanting to be the education secretary so he could fix it. He was not going to let mere pragmatism get in the way of what was going on. And he did all kinds of things. He brought in the emergency teacher scheme. He literally opened school halls, said, anybody wants to be a teacher, turn up. We will find a way to make you a teacher. The unions hated it. He still did it. And then the other one he did was he used to work at the Anderson shelters. And so he used the guys who'd been building the Anderson shelters to come and start rebuilding the schools. So a lot of the problems we have today with things like the construction of our schools is because they sort of threw up these metal and concrete and glass buildings that were only supposed to last about 25 years. But they did, in fact, last a very, very long time. So for me, he is an extraordinary education secretary. Lost, really, in time. People don't remember him.
That's an amazing choice. I want to see the National Theatre do a play about him. They're doing a play about Nye Bevan at the moment. They should do one on this guy. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And if you are not a member of the Para Test crew, you can head to the paratest.co.uk or the paratest.substack.com. You'll get episodes ad-free and early before anyone else. And there's also an exclusive chance to be part of the podcast and lots more. Also, Do get involved with us. If you've got any questions or comments or like ideas you'd like us to explore, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us on pod@theparatest.co.uk. You can also get involved on social media as well.
And we've also got our brand new YouTube channel, which is Power Test Pod, and you can find clips on there. The Power Test only exists because of the amazing support from you, our members, and our supporters. And we're also delighted to have the backing of some brilliant organisations like the Future Governance Forum, which is providing intellectual and practical infrastructure vital to the revival of progressive government in the UK, and the Centre for Progressive Policy, a think tank championing inclusive economic growth. We're also really glad to have support from the Institute for Global Change, who provide us with exceptional research and briefings, and also partner with the fantastic Labour List, bringing to life many of the issues, themes and discussions we're covering on the pod.
Ever Googled your own name? Prepare for a shock because your personal info, including addresses and phone numbers, is out there, especially with the recent hacks at some big phone and healthcare companies. But here's where Aura steps in. Aura scans the dark web for your sensitive information and sends real-time alerts. Aura also actively requests that your information be removed from data broker sites, putting you back in control. Aura provides you with a complete online safety toolkit, credit and transaction monitoring, a secure password manager, a privacy-enhancing VPN, and more. Try Aura risk-free with a 14-day trial at aura.com/safety. That's AURA.com/safety. Rest easy with Aura. Visit AURA.com/safety today.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
So, Robert, tell the people, what's a pretendian?
It's just what it sounds like, Angel. A pretend Indian.
Someone who fakes being one of us?
Someone who impersonates a native.
We're talking about real scammers and con artists.
There are pretendians teaching at universities, pretendians running governments, pretendians in Hollywood.
On our new podcast, Pretendians, we'll tell you the incredible story of these jaw-dropping frauds.
Who are they? Why do they do it? And how the heck do they keep getting away with it?
Listen to Pretendians on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.